What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Today let's get started. The last time the US tried to take over Canada, it went horribly wrong. The United States and Canada have had a relationship full of ups and downs, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries. As a colony of Great Britain, Canada was a threat during the Revolutionary War and again during the War of 1812. As a result, the US pushed into Canada to try to seize land for itself while simultaneously snatching it out of the hands of its enemy. The War of 1812 was especially devastating and humiliating for the young country. While the American Continental Army had unsuccessfully tried to take Canadian land and drive out the British, the US now faced its former rulers while simultaneously trying to prove itself to the world. The War of 1812 became the first conflict the US took part in as an independent nation after the British repeatedly seized American goods and ships in its contest with France to control international trade. The Napoleonic Wars, which took place in Europe and Africa, also saw battles between Britain and France. Despite its neutrality in that conflict, the United States was ultimately unable to completely escape it. U.S. forces tried to gain Canadian support with the Detroit River Campaign in July 1812. In June 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain, the first time the nation had ever formally declared war on any nation. The following month, General William Hull crossed the Detroit River into Upper Canada and seized the city of Sandwich. He proclaimed on July 12, 1812, that the army he led has invaded your country and the standard of the Union now waves over the territory of Canada. Hull made it clear that it presents neither danger nor difficulty to the peaceful, non-offending resident. I come to find enemies, not to make them. I come to protect, not to injure you. The United States offer you peace, liberty, and security. Your choice lies between these and war, slavery, and destruction. Choose then, but choose wisely. And may he who knows the justice of our cause, and who holds in his hand the fate of nations, guide you to a result the most compatible with your rights and interest, you peace and prosperity. Hull believed that being a citizen of the U.S. was preferable to serving the British, and that the invasion would quell any attempts by indigenous groups to contest him. British General Isaac Brock, on the other hand, expressed support for Great Britain in response to Hull's statement, and reminded Canadians of their oaths to the monarchy. He also promised to protect indigenous groups and their land. Just over 1 month into the Detroit River Campaign, U.S. forces surrendered. General William Hull quickly realized that Canadians did not support the U.S. cause and that his troops were ill-equipped to deal with their opposition. Hull's notion that Canadians would welcome Americans wasn't just wrong, it also antagonized them. In his proclamation, he'd also said that, if savages are let loose to murder our citizens and butcher our women and children, this war will be a war of extermination. In short, fighting alongside indigenous peoples would result in death. And since the British would necessarily engage native groups in the conflict, there was no incentive to desert. In addition to scaring Canadians and essentially bolstering their resolve to drive the Americans out, Hull and his men did not have sufficient weapons or men to fight back when the enemy made their attacks. Hull had to retreat back across the Detroit River in early August after he received word from Porter Hanks, a lieutenant stationed at Fort Michilimackinac, later Fort Mackinac, that he had surrendered to the British several days earlier. Additional news that American forces ordered to escort a supply train as it headed to Detroit were ambushed added to the bad news. Hull took refuge at the Fort Detroit once back on U.S. soil, and within days, Brock sent a message. The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my inclination to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences. Brock was using Hull's own words against him and playing on the general's fear of indigenous fighters. Hull resisted surrendering for a time, but handed over Fort Detroit to the British on August 16, 1812. At the Battle of Queenston Heights, the United States strategy failed completely. When General Isaac Brock heard that American forces were gathering at Fort Niagara for another attempt at invasion, he moved east toward the border between New York and Canada. On October 13, 1812, General Stephen Van Rensselaer directed his troops to advance on Queenston with up to 6,000 men under his command. Van Rensselaer had planned his attack with a lot of uncertainty, but he didn't know that the British probably knew what he wanted to do. When British forces tried to facilitate a prisoner exchange on October 12, they were told it wouldn't happen until the day after tomorrow. From that, it became clear that something was in the works for October 13. American forces had little success from the outset. Several boats that set out across the Niagara River before sunrise didn't make it across, and those who did suffered high casualties. However, the U.S. troops that had arrived at Queenston pushed forward and moved up the bluff in an effort to gain upper hand. The British counter-assault was resisted and Brock was killed, but the Americans were about to experience another challenge. When members of the New York militia refused to fight for General Winfield Scott because they feared the presence of indigenous warriors, Scott and the rest of his men were left without support. Their only option at that point was to surrender. The U.S. saw a few minor successes but gained nothing from future attempts to invade Canada. The United States of America participated in a number of minor conflicts in the region following the Battle of Queenton Heights, none of which provided any real advantages. The Battle of York in April 1813 was a small victory for the U.S. when Fort York was taken and the British were pushed out of the then capital of Upper Canada. U.S. forces stayed for less than a week, looting and destroying much of the town, as described by Ely Plater, the tavern keeper in York. The appearance of the town York and garrison were dismal, the latter shattered and rent by the balls and the explosion of the magazine. Not a building but show some marks of it and some all torn to pieces. The town thronged with the Yankees, many busy getting off the public stores. The council office with every window broke and pillaged of everything that it contained. The blockhouse, the government building, and the adjacent building all burned to the ground. Even after all of that, the remaining structures were destroyed when U.S. troops returned in July 1813. The U.S. held areas around Fort George in 1813 before abandoning them, and made several unsuccessful attempts to capture Montreal that same year. When American forces tried once again to make inroads in 1814, they were never able to pacify the area enough to maintain a presence at strongholds like Fort Erie. In the end, Canada didn't want to be a part of the United States. The United States finally left Fort Erie on November 5, 1814, blowing it up as they retreated. This put an end to the American attempt to conquer Canada. The last time the U.S. tried to take over Canada, it went horribly wrong. Today, the United States and Canada are peaceful neighbors with one of the longest undefended borders in the world. But things weren't always so friendly. The United States attempted to conquer Canada, a British colony at the time, at the beginning of the 19th century but failed. During the War of 1812, the most famous attempt failed catastrophically for the Americans. A campaign that was supposed to be quick to liberate or seize, depending on how you look at it, Canadian territory ended up being a series of embarrassing retreats, failed invasions and stunning defeats. A young nation with lofty goals after gaining independence from Britain in the Revolutionary War, the United States was still a young, ambitious nation looking to prove itself on the world stage. Tensions with Great Britain remained high, especially over maritime rights, trade restrictions, and British support of Native American resistance to American expansion in the Northwest Territory. By 1812, frustrated by continued British interference, the U.S. declared war, its first official declaration of war as a nation. American leaders also had their eyes on Canada. They believed conquering the lightly populated Northern Territory would be easy, and that Canadians would welcome the American army as liberators from British rule. However, this was a significant error in judgment. Detroit's debacle under General William Hull. Things started off badly. In July 1812, General William Hull led American forces across the Detroit River into Upper Canada, capturing the town of Sandwich, now part of Windsor, Ontario. Under the Stars and Stripes, he issued a grand proclamation promising Canadians peace, freedom, or war and destruction if they refused. But his promises rang hollow, especially as he warned of a war of extermination if indigenous fighters joined the British side.